Welcome back, everybody. And okay. I have the pleasure of introducing our next lecturer. Dr. Laura Wray Lake is an associate professor of social welfare and human development and psychology at the University of California, Los Angeles, here at UCLA. She received her PhD in human development and family studies from Penn State University in 2010. Dr. Wray Lake's program of research aims to explain the development of civic engagement across adolescence and young adulthood and identify factors that enhance youth civic engagement. This interest is grounded in the assumption that adolescents and young adults hold abundant potential to act as positive change agents and address society's problems on local, national, and global scales. She has published over 65 research articles and book chapters, and her work uses multiple methodologies and takes developmental, cultural, and contextual perspectives in studying youth civic engagement. Recent work includes a Society for Research in Child Development monograph that presents an in-depth qualitative examination of civic engagement among urban youth of color. She has received grant funding from the National Science Foundation, Templeton Foundation, Spencer Foundation, and the Corporation for National and Community Service. In 2020, she was awarded a mid-career award for research excellence from the Society for Research on Adolescence. Dr. Wray Lake currently serves as an associate editor at the Journal of Research on Adolescence and as an elected member of the Executive Council of the Society for Research on Adolescence. Her forthcoming co-authored book, Young Black Changemaking and the Road to Racial Justice, will be published in 2023 by Cambridge University Press. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Laura Wray Lake.
Stand right here. Let me just get situated here. Okay, can everyone hear me all right? Yes, okay. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for having me and Vanessa for the introduction. And I'm so excited to be here. It's wonderful to see all your faces. Welcome to UCLA and Los Angeles. And I really hope that you have a wonderful time at the Institute or the International Summer University. So how do I click forward? Should I? Okay. Oh, just click. Okay, great. So I'm going to be presenting to you today on some of the findings from the book project that I'm working on related to Young Black Changemakers and the Road to Racial Justice. And as I get started, I just wanted to begin with my own positionality as a white woman doing research with Black youth. It's really important for me to have Black co-authors, and I do not do this work alone. This is my larger research team. We have a very collaborative team of an undergraduate student, MSW students, PhD students, and other scholars. And we have done every piece of the project collaboratively every step of the way. So this is my wonderful team. Before I tell you about my findings, I want to set the stage for this project by just talking a little bit about Black youth in the United States. We have an abundance of evidence that Black youth and Black people in the United States experience racism at many different levels. There's interpersonal racism, which is the racism that comes in everyday life through everyday interactions in school context, in community context, as well as on social media. There's cultural racism, which is racism that comes through negative stereotypes and social norms that pervade our culture. And there's institutional racism, and that's the racism that is embedded in the systems and the structures in our society, whether it be the educational system, the social welfare system, or the economic system. So this anti-Black racism is deeply dehumanizing. It's a violation of human rights, civil rights, and it causes significant harm to the health and well-being of Black young people. Since the beginning of anti-Black racism, there has also been resistance and challenge to that racism by Black communities. We know we've seen since slave rebellions to the civil rights movement to the Black Lives Matter movement today, there has been large-scale uprising against anti-Black racism. Black people have also struggled for liberation in their everyday lives, in individual ways, through collective acts that go beyond large-scale social movements and are more localized to their everyday lives. And that's partly what our book jumps off from, is trying to understand how Black young people of today are navigating anti-Black racism and how they are resisting and challenging that racism. So we take a particular focus. We're particularly interested in young people, Black young people, because adolescence is a period where young people begin to become critically conscious. And I saw that critical consciousness is a framing of this 2-week university. So I'm sure that you will be talking more about that. But in adolescence, young people start to understand the roots of racism, the causes, the history. Young people can connect that history to their own personal experiences, and they can also start to channel those understandings and knowledge into social and political action. Okay, so when we look at the contemporary research on young people's civic engagement, well, first, let me just start with what do I mean when I say civic engagement? Civic engagement is an umbrella term that is used to classify or understand all kinds of ways that people can contribute to their communities and to larger society. So civic engagement is inclusive of helping behavior informally, volunteering, advocacy, organizing, and other types of political action, voting, etc. So civic engagement is a large umbrella. When we look at the research on young people's civic engagement, it really comes from a lot of different disciplines, including social work, but also developmental psychology, education, political science, lots of different disciplines, sociology as well. And when we look at this research, a lot of it has focused on middle-class white young people. So a lot of our theories and research in the United States have been centered on the experiences of white youth and used to generalize to other groups. And so the understanding of Black youth civic engagement has really been absent. So Black youth have been largely ignored in that research. Of course, there is a body of research, though, that's growing on youth of color and Black youth's civic engagement that really centers their voices. And that's the work that we're building on in this book. Most of the research on Black youth in general, particularly from a social work perspective, has used a deficit lens. And so a lot of the research on Black youth really looks at Black youth through a lens of problems that they are facing or assume to have caused problems themselves. So research on Black youth civic engagement is really partly flipping the script away from a deficit-based perspective and instead prioritizing the strengths and the power of Black youth and their communities. And then I've already mentioned that Black communities have a very long history and tradition of racial justice action, but also they have rich histories of mutual aid and community building and helping. So this book also builds on that work and identifies the experiences and opportunities within community spaces that support Black youth civic engagement. And we see this as really important for informing practice, as well as organizations and institutions that work with Black youth in the United States. So just to summarize the research goals of this book, we're really interested in studying young Black change making, which I'll just a bit more in a minute, to challenge the dominant narratives in the research literature about Black youth. We're also interested in amplifying and learning from young Black civic leaders. And we want to use this work to inform community-based organizations that serve Black youth. So we recruited Black youth for this study from organizations in Los Angeles, and we're regularly in contact with those organizations to share and dialogue about the findings. We're also interested in more broadly strengthening local and national investment in communities of color. And related to that, this study was funded by what's now called AmeriCorps. AmeriCorps is a federal agency in the United States that oversees our national service programs. And several of those programs have young adults that go out into communities to work with community-based organizations to build infrastructure and capacity for people to thrive. And so AmeriCorps funded this research to try to understand more about how could they make investments in communities that serve Black youth. So we're regularly communicating the findings back to them as well. Okay, so I'll try to quickly go through the methods, but I just want to give you a sense of how we did the study. And I don't see a clock in here, so you might have to just like tell me as I'm getting close to time. We did one-on-one interviews with adolescents who identified as Black and as highly civically engaged. They were all located in Los Angeles, living in different communities in Los Angeles. We collected the data from February to August of 2020. So if you think back to that time period, you can probably know that our study was disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we shifted a lot of our recruitment strategies and our interviews to be virtual. So many of them were virtual. You also remember that George Floyd was murdered by police on May 25th of 2020. And that led to a racial justice uprising all across the nation. And that also influenced our study in that was a very important moment that young people were a part of and they were processing. And so we made space in the interviews for them to do that. And then we also tried to re-interview some of the young people we had talked to before to get their reflections and processing of the current moment. Okay. Our sample was 43 Black youth that we interviewed. They were embedded and involved in 13 different community-based organizations in Los Angeles. And what's to me surprising is they came from 37 different high schools in Los Angeles. And I think that just speaks to how big Los Angeles is and how many different school opportunities there are. Their schools are mapped there so you can see how far they range across the geography of Los Angeles. They were between the ages of 13 to 18. They all identified as Black, but 42% identified as also being of another race or ethnicity as well. I'll just continue on. Here are a few of the questions that we asked in sense of what we really talk to the young people about. And I say we, but I didn't do any of the interviews. We had all Black interviewers on our team, which was also very important. We felt to have that matching, but we asked them to talk to us about the ways that they were civically engaged, how they became civically engaged, what they thought was unique about civic engagement for Black youth, to share with us about their Black identity and other identities they held that really informed their civic engagement, and then also to reflect on that current political moment of racial justice uprising and police violence in the United States. I won't go through this, but we had a multi-step analytic process that we went through. Again, it was very collaborative. So our whole team engaged in coding or checking the codes, as well as writing memos as we reflected on the excerpts and the transcripts. And then we have met once a week for about 2 years to talk through the findings and process and interpret and put together the themes that we have in the book. These are just a sampling of some of the major, which again just kind of shows you like what's in the data, which is, you know, ways of being civically engaged, influences and consequences of civic engagement, their identities and worldviews, and then being Black and civically engaged. We tried to capture some developmental process of how they became civically engaged and also what context these experiences were happening in. And I'm going to present to you findings from 3 of the chapters in the book. We have 9 chapters. We're actively, deeply engaged in this writing process with the deadline of November 1st. So we're quickly trying to write and rewrite and edit. So it's that's what I'm focused on this summer along with my team. But I'm going to focus on just a few of the findings to give you a flavor. And I'm going to start with our second chapter, which really focuses on describing what is young Black change making. So how are these Black youth civically engaged? And when we started this process of like mapping out all the different ways that Black youth are civically engaged, we realized that what they're doing was important, but maybe not as important as why they were doing what they're doing. And so, so our analysis came to connect the civic actions they were doing with what we call the civic purpose, the why, the larger long-term goal of their civic actions. And so when young people align their civic actions with that larger purpose, that's really what we're calling change making. And for Black youth, the change making really, really largely focused on making lives better for other Black people. So that was a larger theme. But there were 3 more specific purposes within that, and they were redistributing resources for racial justice, navigating an anti-Black world, and giving back to the Black community. So I'm going to give you some examples from each of those. And I'm going to start with what does it mean to redistribute resources for racial justice? Under this larger purpose, young people were really concerned with the racial inequities that they saw in their local communities, often actually in their schools. And they felt compelled and passionate about addressing these inequities in different ways. Some was through helping redistribute resources that they may have or their community had. So they engaged in helping, but also in organizing. And that's where we found Quinn. So Quinn was a community organizer. These are all pseudonyms that young people chose for themselves. But Quinn is a community organizer in Los Angeles, and she's part of an organization that trains young people to organize in their schools around racial inequity. And as part of this organization, they went to the school board to talk about the fair distribution of funding across schools in Los Angeles County. So LAUSD, Los Angeles Unified School District, is a very, very large school district. There's many different schools, and they felt that there was inequity in how the funds were being distributed. So Quinn was telling us about these actions, and then this is her why, this is her purpose. She said, because I want to be able to have the same opportunities as everybody else. And I want people in my younger generation status to have the same opportunities too. I don't want us to go through all these budget cuts and we not have books and all this stuff. I just want to have the same opportunity so we have a better chance of doing what we want to do in the future. Okay. Another larger civic purpose that the young people had was navigating an anti-Black world. And what this means is that they were experiencing racism on those many different levels in their day-to-day lives. And they were engaging in civic actions in ways that help them navigate that. And there were two different ways that really came out of the data. One was doing civic engagement that dispelled negative stereotypes about Black youth. And I'll kind of come back to that one in a little bit. But the other way that they navigated an anti-Black world was preparing themselves and other Black youth for survival in this context. And so this is where we find Destiny. Destiny was a 16-year-old Black girl who shared with us a story of walking to the mall and having police pull a gun on her and her friends. And this was a very traumatic experience for her, but it happens to many other Black youth in her neighborhood and in the United States in general. So Destiny was very passionate about preparing other Black youth to know their rights when they do encounter police. So know your rights workshops are common to find in communities of color where young people or any age come together to talk about what are your rights when you're stopped by a police officer. So Destiny and some other youth ran workshops like this, and she explained to us why this is her passion. And she said, we're very passionate about, like, you need to know your rights and knowing what happens if a police pulls you over. A lot of kids don't understand how precious a Black life is or how precious their life is. So, it was a deep passion of hers to do this because in doing so, she was also uplifting her own Black humanity and the humanity of other Black youth who she was working with. And then a third larger purpose was giving back to the Black community. And young people did this in a number of different ways. So it was a larger goal that really guided what they did, was to strengthen their own communities. And there were different ways, but one that was common was when young people would focus on their own success so that in the long term, they could come back and use that education or use those skills to do something good and important for their community. And that's really what Faye talked to us about. Faye says, I want to go to college and get a business degree. Being Black myself in America, I want to be able to have a strong business degree. And she says it would help me venture into different things because everything is backed up with business, and I'll be able to serve my community also, to actually help my community by having that degree, being in school and graduating as a Black woman. So you can see in this example that for Faye, getting a business degree is not just a personal goal that she has for herself. It's connected to a larger civic purpose of coming back to her community, using that skill to strengthen her community. And she talks about Later, she talks about gentrification, and she's very concerned about that issue in her community. And so by getting this business degree, she can start a small business and help other people start small businesses to strengthen the economy of her community. This, I think, is interesting because a lot of times in the civic engagement literature, we don't really name getting education or focus on academics as a civic action. But for a lot of the Black youth that we talked to, it certainly was a part of their larger civic purpose. Okay, so now I want to move to talking a little bit about Black identity and community and how that was central to young Black change making. And some of the key insights to take away here are that Black young people are developing their identities while they're doing change making. So the change making that they're doing informs their identity development, and also their identity is really interconnected with being a change maker. So I'll just tell you about each of these themes one by one. So one of our themes was that Black legacies build collective Black identity. And when we think about Black legacies, it's part of what I already talked about before, the rich history of being Black in America, that where there are racial justice struggles and successes over many, many years. And I think Martin says this very well when he says he's talking about our rights. And when he says our, he's talking about the Black community, Black people. Our rights, our liberty, our equality has always been a big thing. We've always been, as people, to a degree, civically engaged. It's kind of been, I guess, a tradition that's been passed down. So the creating social movements and also smaller acts of resistance and challenging racial oppression is embedded in Black culture and history. And these young people see it as part of their legacy. It's a tradition that they are continuing on for their community. So in describing this, they are connecting themselves to this, to the Black community. It's part of their identity. Success with Lex also talks about this a bit, and she says, so the Black Lives Matter movement in the US was documented to be larger than any other social movement in the history of our country in terms of the number of protesters. And she says, seeing the Black Lives Matter movement has grown bigger than that movement is crazy to me, because the civil rights movement invoked so much change. The Martin Luther King era, the Malcolm X era, all of that invoked change. But seeing in this day in time, our movement is bigger than that. I feel like we're onto something. And this decade might just be the decade where we finally get to change that. We've been fighting for it for 201 years. So you can hear, first of all, hear the power in that, that what she's taking from this history, and it's motivating, her and her peers to continue this work. Another key idea is that change making is one way that young people resist negative stereotypes about Black youth. And that kind of goes back to the navigating the anti-Black world that I already mentioned. But a lot of young people saw their own civic engagement as an act of resistance against those stereotypes. Damien was a young person that engaged in a lot of different civic actions, from helping to organizing. And he says that this civic engagement sets a positive image on us, because like how the news, they portray us in a bad way. And by us, he's talking about Black people. They portray us in a bad way. They don't show the good stuff we do in the community. And if there's a bunch of people doing good things, then they're going to have to show that. That we're creating change. So by doing civic engagement and having it be publicly visible, one of his goals is to try to change the narrative, to flip the script. So that's one of the goals of our book. And interestingly, it's one of the goals of a lot of young people that we talk to try to change and challenge the dominant narratives about Black youth. Her also says this. She says, I feel like society puts us in this box where we're either in a gang, we're poor, we're just very like lower class or whatever. So I feel like Black people especially, or even community of color, in doing civic engagement, it shows them that we're not these people that society. So again, challenging those negative stereotypes through the civic engagement that they're doing. And then finally, within sort of this identity umbrella, becoming more aware of acts of egregious racism, and connecting that, having that personal experience and connecting it to the larger issues can really spark racial justice change making. And to illustrate this, I want to share a story from Joe Cornell, who is part of a larger advocacy group for Black students in predominantly white private schools in Los Angeles. So it's a collective of students who are advocating for Black youth in these predominantly white spaces. And as part of that group, they held a panel discussion about police violence and the Black Lives Matter movement. And in that panel discussion, they had a few white students join uninvited to what they call Zoom bomb. And they named some different racial slurs and other inappropriate and racist words that they used. And so Joe Cornell was sharing that with us. And he said, that was an epiphany moment for me, in the sense that Black people and organizers in general, we so often play defense. And it's like everything we do is a reaction to white supremacy or acts of bigotry. And I realized that that really influenced the way that I want to move forward in this work. I don't want to play defense. I don't want to wait for something to happen to me or some sort of damage to be inflicted on me or my psychological, emotional, mental health before I do something or say something. So he was already deeply embedded in this work, but that moment sparked for him a new clarity in the way that he wanted to do this racial justice, the way that he wanted to fight for racial justice, not just in defense or as a reaction to things that happen, but being proactive. Okay. So the last set of findings I want to share focuses on the role of community-based organizations and the way that they can act as hubs or as, giving opportunities for Black young people's agency. And specifically civic agency. So when I say civic agency, I'm really talking about the competence and the power that people have to create social and political change. So that's known by many other different names as well: empowerment, efficacy. But some of our key insights from the young people is that the organizations they were involved in offered a lot of different ways for them to build civic agency. And that was really key to sustaining them in the long-term work that they were doing. So I'll go through each of just really 3 examples. We had more in the data, but I'll just focus on 3 examples. So one is that organizations offer opportunities for young people to see the impact of their work firsthand. And that seeing that impact is a way for them to build agency. And I love this example from Unique. So Unique is also in a grassroots community organizing organization that serves Black and Brown communities. And she took part in organizing a large-scale protest to defund police in the school systems in LAUSD, the Los Angeles Unified School District. And she tells us like what that meant for her. She says, I felt empowered I felt like I could move the world because we actually got it to happen. That's the crazy part. Like, it's one thing when you want something to happen and you're just speaking on it, but when you're really acting on it, that's something different. So when that happened, I was like, oh, we can really do this. Like, we're really out here. So yeah, I feel empowered. Like, I felt unstoppable. I was like, okay, Unique, you better go, girl. So you can just hear how obviously she used the word empowered. So she's feeling very empowered through seeing the success of creating this large scale protest. And actually, later on, after we interviewed her, that movement actually had a tangible success in defunding police in the school systems. And so these young people like Unique were part of this real change that was happening in Los Angeles. And seeing that impact really gives youth this feeling of power that they can continue, because this work is hard. Organizations can also offer opportunities for young people to take ownership of civic work. And I think this is really important for adults who are in organizations to hear, that young people need to have some control and power over what they're doing in these organizational spaces. Camille shares about this. She was part of a community service focused organization that is designed for Black youth and families. And she was sharing about sort of growing up in this organization and what it means for her now to be an adolescent in the organization and have more ownership. She says, it's like our job to organize it ourselves. So as I've gotten older in the organization, I've really gotten more of an appreciation for doing civic engagement and organizing it myself based on what I care about. Because when I'm younger, it's just like, oh, let's make lunches for homeless people. But now that I'm older, it's a lot more in my hands. And I've taken that into a lot more, or taken that experience into a lot more areas of my life. And I've learned how to advocate not only for myself, but for people who don't have voices in terms of standing up for everyone. So giving young people like Camille and others control over what types of civic work they do in an organization can help them find their voices and allow them to become advocates for themselves and others. And then finally, organizations can offer important opportunities for Black youth to be in community with other Black people. And especially when Black youth were doing work fighting anti-Black racism, it was very important for them to feel that they were in a space that was welcoming and safe and where they could be themselves. And often that was a space that really centered Black youth. And Kevin shares a little bit about this when he was he was a part of a organization focused on social justice that served Black and brown young people and in that community. And he helped organize a protest that was also a block party. When he's reflecting on this, he says, I helped with the protest and block party where people can have fun and just be around the other people and show community that we share engagement and just be powerful in who they are. And then he went on to say, it encouraged me to engage. I don't know how to say it, but to me, engaging and being powerful in who you are means that you'll be more open and stuff like that, I guess. So he's articulating both that this space of community was really meaningful for him and others. And when he says being powerful in who you are, that they felt like they could be themselves and they felt that power, that agency. And that made him feel more engaged so he could keep going in the work that he was doing. So I've shared a lot, but I want to just try to give a few broad takeaway points and then happy to take questions if we have time for that. One of the broad takeaways is that all Black youth are different. You know, there's not just one type of change making. I think there might be certain visions of Black youth organizers or certain visions of Black young people, but they're engaged in many different actions from local helping, volunteering, and political action, many different actions. And we really love that about this study, the variability and all the different ways that young people choose these journeys into change making. But yet there are some shared experiences that Black youth have. Young Black change making is really intertwined with Black culture and identity, and often does focus on challenging anti-Black racism. And that is, that's always in their context that they're facing, regardless of what kinds of work that they're doing. And one of the most applied parts, I think, of the study is really focused on organizations and what types of opportunities organizations really offer or don't offer for Black young people. So Black young people did share with us times when they didn't feel welcome or they did feel racism within community-based organizations, and then they would pull back from those organizations. So it is important, I think, to understand just how organizations can offer opportunities that support Black youth in their civic engagement work. So I will stop there. I'll just briefly acknowledge again AmeriCorps that funded the study, and I hope that they will take our findings and use them in their work. Also, we're very grateful for the community organizations that were our partners and the young people who spoke with us. So thank you very much. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you want the mic?
Yeah, so but it actually, the thing is about this classroom is that if it doesn't go into the mic, it doesn't get recorded. Like in our, Yes.
How far can I hold? Does that work? No. Okay. I'm like kind of going back to the first point from the conclusion and saying that there's not just one type of young Black change maker. I'm kind of curious, like when it came to the Black Lives Matter movement, like what kind of variations did you see within the type of civic engagement that the Black youth were doing? Like, was there one form that was like the most popular, or was there like a decent variation across the different types of civic engagement? So just kind of want to hear a little bit about that.
Sorry, this is hilarious. Am I doing that?
COVID times. Yes. So that's a great question. And we do have a chapter on that in the book. I just, didn't get to it, but there was a lot of variation. So there were some young people who were out in the streets protesting and organizing protests in that summer of 2020. There were other young people who didn't feel safe doing so, I think for different reasons. One, because of the police violence against protesters. And the other reason was because of the COVID pandemic. So we were having the dual pandemics of racism and COVID-19. And so some of those young people were more engaged on social media. And that took different forms too. There was more like some collective organizing work that was strategic happening on social media, but there's also the everyday, what we call interpersonal civic action, where young people were talking about racism to their friends and peers on social media. And that was very challenging, I think, for a lot of them, because they were encountering a lot of ignorance and whiteness. And so it was, one of the things we found was that there's an everyday burden of doing that work on social media, but the youth were pretty engaged in that as well. There are other young people who really were more focused on service. So they're really, following along with the Black Lives Matter movement, but they're not really engaged in sort of activism or protesting. Their framing is more about helping their Black community. And so doing like mutual aid, that types of care is what they were more focused on at that time.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Professor Wray Lake has helped me develop my scholarship for a significant portion of the last academic year, so she's aware of my research interests. And so I heard you briefly sort of touching about the impact of civic engagement for Black youth. And I was wondering if your research at all touches on the impact to psychological well-being that civic engagement had on Black youth, and how you see civic engagement as a potential intervention to address health and mental health in Black communities.
And if I can just add a question so we can stack. I think it's, if you could talk about the dynamics of your research team. So I know I taught the qualitative methods class where we talked about, and folks mentioned your study, who are part of the study actually. And I think Professor Wray Lake embodies a consciousness about what her positionality means in the research team, and also prioritizing the voices of co-authors, talking about authorship upfront, which is a dynamic in the academy that doesn't happen very often. This is a power. Anyway, so I don't know if you want to talk about that as well, just in terms of research practice and racial justice.
Does it still work? Okay. Okay. So first, about the question about civic engagement for Black youth and its connection to health. I think this study didn't really dive into that, but I do have other work that goes into that more. And that is a really growing body of research especially for young people of color, in thinking about, the civic work, especially around racial justice. Is that a healing sort of work? And there's some theories and ideas that it can be very healing to collectively to do this work in the face of oppression. And then there's also some thinking that because we know that exposure to racism is very challenging. And when you're doing this work, you're more exposed to and thinking about racism on different levels. And so similar to that, the research is very mixed about how activism relates to health and well-being. I had a graduate student who just published a paper with me on reviewing this literature across like what has been published. And she found that it's very nuanced in terms of sometimes activism. We know that there's burnout. We know that there's, harm from racism that can come from it. And then other times it can really benefit people's well-being to be part of it. So I think really it's all about the context, right? So, thinking back to our study and the importance of creating safe and welcoming spaces for Black youth to be in community with each other, I think that that is the type of space that might really lead to this collective healing and well-being, that you need to have times to kind of step away from the movement and experience some community and joy and fun. That's I may not have fully reflected that part of the data, but Black youth did talk about like the joy and the fun and the community part of it a lot more. And I think that is that may be really the key to connecting activism to well-being. To the question about more of the dynamics of the authorship team, I think that's such a good question because, you know, it is hard to do work with a large team, I think. But I find it very rewarding. And as I said, with my positionality, I wasn't going to do this work by myself. I think it's very important to me, this work, because I think that Black youth are so underrepresented and undervalued in the literature. And so I was interested in rectifying that, but I understand that I don't know everything about what it's like to be a Black young person. And I got this funding opportunity. And so for me, the first step was to create a collaborative team. And it wasn't important to have people with a lot of established expertise necessarily. And so finding student collaborators was one of the best parts of the project. And when student collaborators came on, I was very clear about how this is a team that I coordinate it, but I'm not really the leader. So I don't have the last word in what we do. And so that was established early on. So it's not just whatever I say goes at the end of the day. We reach a lot of consensus about, what is really going on. And so we created a culture in our group where, regardless of what your status was, whether you were an undergraduate or whether you were a full professor, that you speak up and say what you think is happening, and everyone has an expertise that they're bringing to the team. And so I remember many times when I was like, this is what I think is happening. And then one of my students would be like, no, this is not right, or this is what this really is, or let's go back to the data and let's look at a different interpretation. And so that I felt like I learned a ton from the project, and just, having equal partners in their work. I really do think that all the team members are equal partners. And we, in terms of authorship, we decided early on, I listed out, this is what a first author does, this is what a second author does, this is the workload. And everyone could sign on to what workload they really wanted to contribute. And then they knew their role on the chapter. So each chapter is authored by, we have many student first authored chapters, and then we have many student co-authors on each chapter. So each chapter has a different author set. And everyone's really clear about their role. And I think that's really, really been important. And even recently, we just changed the contract because the final chapter was supposed to be just the faculty co-authors, because I was thinking, oh, it's the summer, no one wants to do the work of writing the last piece. But then I realized we all collectively processed what the takeaways were together. And so it didn't make sense for just the three of us to author. So we changed it to where we're all authors of the last chapter. And so I'm really excited about having that be the culmination of the work. And we're going to have a piece where each author reflects on their positionality and what they really think are the key takeaways, because we all have different practice experience, different academic expertise. And so we all see it a little bit differently, and also in shared ways. And so I'm excited to be able to represent that in the last chapter of the book.
Why don't we gather the last set of questions and then we can address them together, if that's okay. So Jay, and then hello. Oh, this is weird. Okay, so this is sensitive, brave question, I guess. So I just say it out of curiosity, respect, obviously. But were there any major factors or conversations that really played into pursuing this study, keeping in mind this kind of dichotomy, balance, challenge between white social work savior complex versus truly engaging to really rectify the Black narrative, and using this as an opportunity to give space rather than being the one to say that I'm gonna
pilot this study and et cetera, et cetera. So just like kind of what that process looked like and like major factors that led into like actually taking on this project and saying that you wanted to move forward with it.
Yeah. We'll gather. Any other questions? Heather and Bobby? All right, let's.
The question I had was, I know the US is so culturally diverse and it changes from state to state. So I was wondering if you looked at how civic engagement changes from Los Angeles compared to Black youth in the South or up in Chicago or over in New York, and the differences in safety and the way they choose to engage.
Okay, Bobby, and then I'll come to the other side.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to know how the Black civic engagement is like, how is it being a catalyst for other communities of color to like voice their opinion and like have a good civic engagement from their side? I wanted to know that.
What's on this side? Oh, okay. Yeah, that.
I was wondering about intersectionality and how feminist struggle fights are taken in your study too. If there's anything spoken about. Or, yeah.
And so those are questions from United States delegation, Australia, India, and Switzerland, right?
Nice.
Yes.
Representation.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for all the questions. And this might be a memory exercise for me, but hopefully I'll remember. Okay, and Vanessa's my backup. So first, more about like the positionality and like really how did I do that process of like deciding to take on the project. And I think for me, it was sort of an opportunity. Like I did another project that was on youth of color. And it was qualitative and it was funded by AmeriCorps. And then they approached me and said, do you want to keep doing this work? And we'll give you this funding to do more. And so I saw an opportunity, particularly my other study wasn't focused on Los Angeles. So I saw this opportunity to really uplift, Black youth's experiences in Los Angeles. And it was really important to have a multiracial team because honestly, I didn't really have that in the previous study. And so I did see firsthand how limited, it was a big limitation of that previous work that I didn't have scholars of color as collaborators. And so I saw that mistake. And this was a chance, I think, for me to rectify that. And so I did right away, as I mentioned, like really focus on building this collaboration. I think that it's been really great for all the students that I've worked with in terms of not just the funding that the study provided for them, but also the opportunity to have a voice in the work. And it was actually the students who wanted to write the book. I thought we were going to just do a few papers and they really wanted to write the book. So it's really like a lot of it led by them. But I think the question is still good because even now that the project is starting to come to a close, I think I'm continually reflecting on like what it should be my role as a white academic. Should I be studying people of color, Black youth? I think that's it's a question I continue to have for myself. And so, I'm happy to do the work in collaboration with others. I think in the future, I probably don't want to be the main leader of the work and more of a supporter. So I think this, it's a continual journey for me. But I still hope that the book, makes an impact in like really reshaping the narrative of how we see Black young people. The next question I think was about like Black youth in different locations in the United States and how might civic engagement look different. And I think that's a really powerful question. This study was really embedded in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles does have a rich history of organizing by Black communities. And so that was a history, you saw it was very important for them as part of a legacy that they were continuing. And many of them talked about like their parents and grandparents who were in the movements in the past and how much they have learned and grown from that. So I feel like the Los Angeles culture was very much alive in the study, in the young people's experiences. It's hard to generalize, like what might be similar and what might be different, from a qualitative study. But the past study that I had done was in Rochester. So it was upstate New York. It was in a community that was predominantly Black and also had a lot of community violence. So in some ways it was more like a smaller community that we drew the young people from. And the civic engagement did look different because they were struggling with everyday community violence on the streets. And so their civic engagement was more in some ways limited, but in other ways more localized. They had to navigate safety in a different, more everyday way than a lot of the young people we talked to in this study. So that just gives a hint at different contexts, but I think that is a really important question that we should continue exploring, that context does matter. So civic engagement will look different in all of your countries. I'm sure that civic engagement looks different. And so I think that's important to hear about and understand. The other question was about how Black movements might influence movements of other communities of color. And I definitely think on a large scale, beyond my particular study, we see that. So Black movements are often leaders in terms of like social movement organizing and innovation and success. And so I think that there is a lot to learn from Black social movements in the US. In our study, it was interesting, different reflections that young people had about intergroup solidarity and collaboration. And some young people really valued that and saw that as the way of the future because they did collaborate with a lot of Latinx youth or undocumented immigrants around, the policing of immigrants is really, there's an overlap with the policing of Black young people in this area and in this country. But other youth, I think, also felt that sometimes their own voice gets lost when there's intergroup movements, like where is the Black youth voice and where is the focus just on Black people and the Black struggle. And so I think there's a lot of tension and complication, around intergroup solidarity and movement spaces. Some of the organizations we work with are very much aware of this, and like this is their struggle that they're working on because a lot of communities are very diverse, and so there's not one issue or there's not one group of people that are oppressed, and so I think organizing spaces really do are talking about this and like wanting guidance or wanting to know what the way forward is. And I think there's not really one answer about how do you do this well, but I think that's a good question for practice is how do you do intergroup movement building in an effective way that still honors the voices of individuals who experience oppression. Was there another question or there was one more. Oh yeah. Okay, yeah. Yes, so intersectionality and feminist struggle. So we did ask young people to talk about other identities besides identifying as Black that really shaped their civic engagement. And probably one of our main findings is that Black girls have unique experiences of overlapping oppression in terms of being Black and being and experiencing sexism, and the ways that those intersect for them is unique, you know, from other groups. And so so Black girls talked about being disregarded sometimes in movement spaces, you know, that maybe the male voice was, you know, seen as, you know, had some more priority. They also talked about being hypersexualized in schools and in communities. And that was a challenge that they faced, you know, as they're doing this civic work. And so so I do think that that's a, you know, it's very important to think not just about a single identity, but how are different identities being experienced by different young people. Some young people were immigrant origin, so they came from another country, and that was another intersectionality that was embedded in the data, as just sort of how they navigate you know, American culture and being Black, and sort of understanding what it means to be Black in America, and also what it means to be American. And so so that was an interesting intersectionality as well. Thank you for all the great questions. Okay.